It's December, guys, which means this is the last tier list of the year that I'll be making, where I'll be ranking every single card in Clash Royale. Now, we haven't gotten balance changes in the last few weeks, at least a full set of them, but we have gotten a couple emergency nerfs, along with the evolved Ice Spirit being added to the game, and just some meta shifts, which always just naturally happen. So I decided to do another list where I rank every card in the game to close out the year. As always, S tier means that the card is very strong, very versatile, and likely could use a small nerf. A tier means the card is just well above average, very strong in the meta. B tier is right around average, maybe slightly above, and then C tier is kind of on the lower end of average. D tier means the card is below average, but maybe doesn't deserve a buff, and then F tier means the card either deserves a buff or is just not viable at all. Starting off, guys, we got the archers, which I'm going to put in C tier. Now, an important note, I'm going to do the evolutions at the very end, so I'm referring to the regular archers here, and I think the primary reason why people are using the regular archers is to eventually have the evolved version, because I think the regular ones are kind of about average in strength. The arrows are going in A tier, definitely a very strong and versatile card right now. You're seeing them a lot inside of giant graveyard decks, lava decks. You could use them in mortar, you could use them in cycle decks. They just pair well in a lot of different things, and they're very consistent because of that large radius, so they're going to be amazing against swarms, and then of course a lot of people using things like minions or archers right now as well. The baby dragon I'm going to put in B tier. I think it's very useful as a support card inside of graveyard decks, and in beatdown decks is where you'll commonly see it, and it's a nice splash card to have. The balloon right now, I'm going to say is C tier because I think there's a lot of buildings and tornado in the meta that counter it so well. You see a lot of people running things like E-Giant, and even stuff like the evolved archers are just so useful against it. And the Little Prince, even though the Little Prince isn't a perfect counter to it, with all the people running the Little Prince, it's another air counter you have to worry about. The Bandit I'm also going to put in C tier. I don't think it's anything too crazy right now, especially with P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam not being in the best spot in the world, and then other Bridge Spam decks in general like Mega Knight Bandit, you don't see a whole lot of, but you see it a fair amount, so I consider it kind of an average or slightly below average card. The Barbell is going to join the arrows in A tier. I just think it's a very versatile card, especially in beatdown decks. You're going to see it in Graveyard, Golem, E-Giant, sometimes even Royal Giant, and then just the uses of it. You can use it on offense, but you can also use it on defense, and both ways you're going to get a lot of value. As always, the Barb Hut is going right into F tier because it honestly just sucks. I mean, Earthquake, Poison, and just a whole lot of other things just get so much value against it. Barbs are going in D tier. Remember, these are the regular barbs, not the evolved, but the regular barbs are not really that great. You're only going to see them in Lava Hound, and oftentimes they just get fireballed or spelled away pretty easily. Bats are going in B tier. Remember, these are just the regular, not the evolved. I think they're pretty solid right now inside of minor wall breakers. Sometimes you're going to see them. Or in Mega Knight wall breakers, too, they're commonly seen. And then mortar from time to time as well. So, fairly versatile. The healer's going to go with the Barb Hut in F tier. I personally don't think she's that good. Even after she got that spawn in heal effect, it hasn't really done very much. And there's sometimes you even see people run Elixir Golem without the healer, which kind of proves that she's not even a requirement inside of E-Golem. Right now, I'm going to put the Battle Ram in D tier. I really don't think it's that good just because there's not a whole lot of P.E.K.K.A. right now, and I just think Bridge Spam in general is not in a great place just because there's a lot of people running buildings, like I said, or even things like Bowler, and it has a really hard time fitting in this meta and reaching the tower. The Bomber's also going to go in D tier. I'm pretty much not seeing really anyone play it. Even inside of Electro Giant, it's very rarely being used, so it's just kind of not really in a great spot in this meta, not versatile at all. That doesn't mean it's unusable. You could use it if you really want to in Drill, but it's not really a requirement. Bomb Tower's going in A tier. You could even make the argument it is S tier. It is so solid right now. You're seeing it inside of minor control with the Little Prince. You could also use it if you want inside of Royal Hogs instead of the cannon. You're of course going to see it with Hog as well. The minor wall breaker Magic Archer Tornado deck you still occasionally see, and it's just overall used so frequently, especially inside of cycle decks, and just gets a ton of value defensively. The Bowler in this current meta is also going in A tier with the Bomb Tower. There is a lot of people running Bowler. You're seeing it a lot inside of E-Giant and Goblin Giant especially, but you can also use it in Graveyard. So in general, it's used inside of heavy decks, but for it being a 5 elixir card, and because it's used in 2-3 meta decks pretty frequently right now, that makes it pretty deserving of the A tier. It is also a very good counter to the Little Prince, which we're seeing constantly right now. The cannon is also going to be going into A tier because in this meta, especially in the Royal Hog Cycle deck, it's actually the deck that finished #1 in the world last season, so that of course proves that the cannon is a very, very good card. It's kind of between the cannon and the bomb tower. You're kind of having to pick and choose which one you prefer to use because both of them are really solid right now. The cannon cart's going to go in D tier. I really do not think it's that good right now. It really kind of fell out of the meta. No one's really using it inside of bridge spam anymore. You're not really seeing it in mortar that much anymore. It's not really required in any deck at this point, so it doesn't really make any sense to put it higher than D tier. Clone is going in F tier. I think it is one of the worst spells in the game right now. There's literally no one even using Lava Clone anymore because of how many people are using Poison and Tornado in this meta, so it's essentially a dead card right now. Dark Prince is going to be going in B tier. I think it's very good, especially inside of things like Goblin Giant. That's a common, synergy you see nowadays with the Dark Prince. It's not super, super versatile. That's kind of the main reason why I'm not putting it in A tier. I mean, you could also use it in E Giant, Golem, and stuff like that if you want, but I don't think it's quite versatile enough to be an A tier. I'm going to put the Dark Goblin in C tier because in this current meta, there's not really many people running bait, and also a lot of the people who are running bait are running Princess, and even Mortar Dark Goblin I'm not seeing a whole lot of. I used to always put the Dark Goblin in at least B tier, but I think right now it's really kind of below average or just straight up average at this point, so that's why I have it in C. The Earthquake I'm going to put in A tier. I think it's one of the most consistent and least risky spells to use in the game because it's fairly cheap, and it also single-handedly completely changed the tide of matches and also what the matchup itself is because of how amazing it is, for example, against spawners and Elixir Collector, and it's also what allows you to break through buildings with your Hog deck or your Royal Hog deck, so it is just such a useful spell to have inside of those decks. I'm going to put the Electro Drag in D tier because for the most part, you're only going to be seeing it inside of Golem. There's not many people running Lumberloon Friege right now, and even Golem for that matter, there's not a ton of people using, but I don't think it's completely unviable or sucks so much to the point it definitely needs a buff. That's why I have it in D tier. I'm going to put the E-Giant in B tier. The E-Giant is very good in the meta, don't get me wrong, but I think a large part of that is for things like the Evolved Knight, the Evolved Archers, and also the Bowler, which happens to pair so well with the E-Giant. And I don't necessarily know if it's the E-Giant itself, but for sure it's an above average win condition right now, which is why I do have it in B tier. I'm going to put the E-Spirit in B tier as well. I think it's very good value, of course, for only 1 elixir, but I'm just not seeing it as frequently as I did even a couple months ago, just because there's other spirits that people are preferring to use instead. I'm going to put the Electro Wizard in C tier. I think it's kind of just a straight up average card. I don't really think it's much higher than that because the decks it's commonly used in, like P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, Giant Double Prince, stuff along those lines, you're not really seeing in the meta. Does that mean it's a bad card? Definitely not, and it's one you could use if you want to in any sort of off-meta deck, but I just don't really think it's as good as it used to be because there's a lot of better options. The E-Barbs are also going to go in C tier. They might be pretty annoying on mid-ladder, but when you have some nice distractions in your deck, they're really not that hard to deal with, and they're not really in any sort of meta deck, so they're kind of just a mid-ladder nuisance, and that's kind of what they are at the end of the day, because they're not really that versatile inside of good decks. Right now, I'm going to put the Elixir Collector in B tier. Usually I have it lower, but it does pair very well in kind of a variety of decks right now. There's a lot of really just kind of spammy type of decks, like with the Recruits, Gob Giant, Elixir Collector, and then even Pump Bow, and just kind of some like annoying stuff. Maybe you'll even see E-Giant or Golem Pump. So I think Elixir Collector is actually in a fairly decent spot right now. Definitely doesn't need a nerf, or it's definitely not A or S, but I think it's solid. Definitely, for the elixir cost it is, it's used a fair amount now. I'm going to put the E-Golem in D tier. I think it's certainly better than the healer, and recently we have seen a rise in the amount of E-Golem used, and a large part of that is because there's decks with the Evo Barbs, and Evo Barbs happen to pair really well with the E-Golem, and Eagle and Pump. So I guess I was just talking about Pump. That's another combination you see sometimes. I'm going to say the Executioner's C tier. I actually really think it's about an average card right now. It used to be very bad, but then ever since it got that health buff, it's slowly but surely been seeing a rise in usage rate, and people are realizing it's quite good inside of minor poison decks especially, or just paired with the Tornado. The Fireball I'm going to put in A tier. I think that there's, another medium spell, which you guys probably already know what it is, that is better than it. But with that being said, it's very, very solid inside of a lot of decks. You could use it with Hog if you want, Expo, Royal Giant, and just having that direct damage can sometimes be really nice depending on the matchup. And remember, this is just the regular Firecracker, not the Evolve. I think she's about C tier. I really don't think she's that versatile because really at the moment in this meta, at least, you're really only seeing her inside of Hog decks. So for that reason, because it's just one deck in archetype, I can't really put her much higher than C, even though just like you guys do, I'm sure, many of you guys, I do think she is very annoying, but she's C tier. Fire Spirit I'm going to put in A tier. I think inside of the Royal Hog deck especially, there's a lot of people that prefer to use the Fire Spirit over the E-Spirit, which is why I put it in B. There's not a lot of people running the E-Spirit right now, and I'm just seeing a lot more people running Fire Spirit recently at the top of ladder over the E-Spirit. That's kind of my main reason why for putting it above. Fisherman's pretty good right now. I'm going to put it in B tier. It's very good inside of the Gob Giant deck, the Gob Giant Bowler deck, and it's in Royal Giant, of course, but because Royal Giant's not in the best spot right now, that's kind of why I have Fisherman in B tier. I think it's in a pretty good spot overall. There's no way, it needs a nerf or anything like that. You could argue it's A, but it's definitely in a very solid spot in this meta. Flying Machine I'm going to put in B tier. I think it's in a good spot right now as well. I'm seeing it pretty frequently inside of Recruits Hogs, which of course there's a fair amount of people using because the Evolved Royal Recruits are very good, and the Flying Machine pairs very well in that deck, doing exactly what it needs to, baiting out Fireball. Archqueen's going to go in C tier. I personally think she's probably one of the worst champions right now, which is why they were considering buffing her for next month in January. I don't really think she's that good because there's a lot of people in this meta running Lightning and Poison and just spells that overall do pretty good against her. And Little Prince, I think, has kind of replaced her in a lot of decks because you can't obviously run Little Prince and Archer Queen in the same deck. So that's another reason why she's not really that good right now. Freeze, I'm going to actually put an F tier. I think the Freeze is pretty bad because I don't really see anyone run Graveyard Freeze even right now. And Lumberloon Freeze, I pretty much almost never see it. I mean, it's the type of thing where it's like you might from time to time, but it's just kind of an exception, at least on the top of ladder. And also, yeah, Furnace is going in F tier as well. It's just not very good at all. Definitely one of the worst buildings in the game. The Giant's going to go in B tier. He's actually really solid right now in Giant Graveyard, especially Giant Graveyard is one of the best decks in the game. I believe it finished second in the world last season or third in the world last season, and right now, and this month at least, we've seen just a rise in the amount of people running Giant Graveyard. It just is pairing very well with a lot of the other cards that are good in this meta, like the Graveyard and the Evolved Archers and the Arrows, so definitely up there. Giant Skeleton's going in D tier. This is a good reason why there's a high chance that it's going to be getting buffed, because it kind of sucks right now. It's not really needed in any deck. There's no meta deck that has it, and you could even make the argument it's F tier, but I'm going to say a large part of it is because of the meta, but still, D tier, one of the worst cards in the game right now, for sure. I'm going to say the Snowball is in C tier. It's better than the Zap right now, for sure, but I still don't think it's anything too crazy because it's pretty much only played in Giant Graveyard. But that is still one deck that is very strong in the meta. That's kind of what gives it C tier instead of D. Goblin Barrel's going into D tier, and by the way, if the Goblin nerf goes through, it's probably going to end up being in F tier, because then the first hit of the Goblins is even slower. But right now, the Goblin Barrel is in a horrible, horrible spot. I mean, Logbait in general is just not really used a lot right now. Definitely one of the weaker, if not, yeah, it's one of the weakest win conditions in the game, without a doubt, which is why it's in D tier. Goblin Cage is going to go in B tier. I think it's a decent building. It got that small buff, which helped it out a bit, so the Brawler doesn't die to lightning, and that's a noticeable buff sometimes for sure. Of course, you're going to see it in Recruits Hogs, and sometimes you're going to see it inside of things like E-Giant or Balloon decks, so not bad at all. Goblin Drill's going in D tier. I think kind of like the Goblin Barrel, it's for sure one of the worst win conditions in the game right now, and it's also why they're considering buffing it for next month, because it just kind of sucks right now. Or they're actually doing a rework for it, but yeah, it's not that good. Goblin Gang's going in B tier. I know they added the third Spear Goblin back, and for a while it kind of seemed like it was A or S tier, but I think things have really toned down a lot, and because bait's not in a great spot in this meta anyway, there's not a whole lot of Goblin Gang. I mean, except, of course, Mortar you're going to see it into, but it's nothing too crazy. It's kind of just right above average. And here we go. We actually finally got to our first S tier card. It's going to be the Gob Giant. It's definitely not the best card in S tier. It's probably going to be actually on the lower end, but it's an S tier. Even after that small emergency nerf it's gotten, it is still proven to be, probably the strongest win condition in the game. It just gets a whole lot of value, and especially paired with some of the other strong cards in the game right now, I think that's also part of the reason that is really making it, very strong as well. The Goblin Hut is going in F tier. That's probably one that is fairly obvious. And the Goblins are going with the Goblin Giant in S tier. I think the Goblins are better than the Gob Giant for sure. I think that ever since there's been 4 of them, they've just been absolutely broken and kind of carrying so many decks, like Minor Cycle, for example, because you can be pretty aggressive and then defend pretty much everything with the Goblins if your opponent doesn't have a log or the proper spell in Cycle. And of course, inside of Hog decks, you're seeing them constantly, and just a lot of other Cycle decks, they're really just kind of defensively extremely strong and counter pushing. Golden Knight's going in D tier. I think he's worse than the Archer Queen. I think that the Golden Knight is probably, you could argue, the worst champion in the game right now, ever since they nerfed the dash range, or the chain of it. It's kind of been pretty bad since then, which is why there's a very good chance it's going to be getting a buff for next month. So I do think that would be a pretty deserved buff. I think the Golem is C tier. It's worse than the E-Giant for sure. There's no way I could put them in the same tier. Golem Pump, though, is not bad. You definitely can use it if you would like, if you're a Golem player, but it's nothing too crazy. There's a lot of win conditions that are way better. Graveyard is A tier. I know a lot of people think it's S tier, but I think it's A. It's very strong, don't get me wrong, but I think there's other priorities on the list, at least nerf-wise, that need it a lot more than the Graveyard, but kind of the randomness of it, where you don't know the skeletons they're going to spawn, and even things such as a poison that don't fully counter it, it's definitely understandable why a lot of people are frustrated with the card. But like I said, I think it's for another time. We can wait a little bit for a nerf because there's definitely priorities. Guards are going in D tier. I think that they're just pretty bad, and they're not a requirement in really any deck, which is why for the most part you pretty much never see them, except in Mortar occasionally or in Lava. And you could even make the argument that they're F tier, and this is why there's a chance they're also going to be getting a buff next month. Heal Spirit's going in C tier. Obviously, it's a 1 elixir card, so it's not really going to be much lower than that, because it's going to pretty much always at least get some value whenever you're using it. And don't get me wrong, when you're using it inside of a Bridge Spam deck or a Sparky deck, it's going to be getting a ton of value, and sometimes that 1 elixir can win you the whole game, so that's why it's kind of an average card. The Hog is going in A tier. Every time I put it in A, there's always some people that say it should be S. The Hog needs a nerf, and honestly, I agree. At some point, I do think the Hog could get a nerf, but kind of like the Graveyard, I think that there's other priorities right now, and I do think, though, it has been a very, very consistent card for the longest time, and I think you definitely could justify a small health nerf of maybe 3 or 4% could tone down kind of the consistency and the usage rate of it. The Hunter's going to go in C tier. I really haven't been seeing him a whole lot recently. I mean, typically you're only seeing him in stuff like Royal Giant anyway, and there hasn't really been a ton of that right now. So, yeah, I don't really think the Hunter's that great now. Ice Golem's going to go in D tier. I really don't think it's in the best spot. I mean, you might see it from time to time, of course, in Hog or Loon Cycle, but you really don't need it, especially when you have things like the Evolved Knight, which are just going to be, much better to have in the deck. Ice Spirit's going in S tier, definitely the best spirit in the game. When I see people run Royal Hog Cycle, they usually prefer to run it with the Ice Spirit over the Fire Spirit or the E Spirit. Same with Hog decks, same with Minor decks, and it is just kind of just everywhere inside of Cycle decks. It buys you so much time, freezing everything. I don't know what kind of nerf it needs or should get, if it even needs one, but I think we can't deny, because of its versatility in Cycle, it is really, really OP. The Ice Wizard is going to go in D tier, because in Splash Yard, a lot of people are using the Little Prince now instead of the Ice Wizard, so it's pretty much not even needed to be used, so I can't really put it much higher than that. Inferno Drag is going to go in B tier. I think some shifts kind of in the meta, with a lot of people running Lightning right now, and there's also more people running E-Giant that I don't really think it's A tier like I usually put it in, because there's also not a ton of people running things like Lava Hound. So I think it's at the point now where it's only slightly above average as a card. Inferno Tower is going to go in C tier. Really don't think it's that good. In fact, when I see it, it's usually when I'm playing against a hog deck or maybe even a miner deck. I rarely play against log bait Inferno anymore. It's really kind of fallen out of the meta. The Knight's going to go in A tier, and this is just the regular Knight, by the way. I truly think the regular Knight is A tier. I mean, the meme is really true. It has good stats for the cost. What can I say? The Lava Hound's going to go in C tier. I don't think it's really that good right now. The last month, at least, it's really proven to be not that great. There's just a lot of people running air counters right now, and a lot of the really strong Evos at the moment don't really pair the best inside of Lava Hound decks, like the Evolved Archers and the Evolved Knight, for instance. So that's kind of the main reason why it's around average. The Lightning's going in A tier. It's obviously not going in S because I don't think it needs a nerf, but in this current meta, we cannot deny that the Lightning is very, very strong inside of Goblin Giant decks, inside of E-Giant decks, and inside of Royal Giant. You're often seeing the Lightning as well. So, you know, a few different beatdown decks that are running it, and for how expensive the spell is being used, especially compared to something like a Rocket, it's being used a pretty solid amount. I think the Lumberjack is kind of D tier. I don't know. I don't really think it's that good right now because there's not really a single meta deck where you really need to use him. You might see him from time to time from some bridge spam players running, you know, Lumberjack Ram Rider, but besides that, I kind of don't really ever see him because Golem players don't really use him that much anymore. Magic Archer is going to go in B tier. I think he took quite a hit after the nerf he ended up getting, but I still see Remieli have a lot of success with his deck, the Remieli deck with the Magic Archer and the Tornado, so I don't think he's completely dead, but he took quite a hit. I mean, he went down from debatably S tier, or A at least, going down to B. Actually, I'll put him in C. I think he's average. I think B's too high. We'll say C. The Mega Knight's going in C tier as well. I feel like when you think of an average card, Mega Knight is kind of one that comes to mind. Mid-ladder players might disagree with that, but he's pretty average when you think about it. I mean, there's Mega Knight Wall Breakers, but no one really runs Mega Knight Ram Rider anymore, so. I'm going to put the Mega Minion in D tier because right now, for the most part, you're only seeing it inside of Lava Hound occasionally. That's kind of about it. I mean, stuff like Giant Double Prince isn't really meta anymore, and just stuff like the Phoenix, Baby Dragon, Inferno Drag, just way better than it. Mighty Miner is going to go in C tier, kind of where the Archer Queen is. I think that they're both just not in a great spot right now, just because of how much better the Little Prince is. Miner's going to go in S tier. And I don't necessarily think it for sure needs a nerf, but just for its versatility and it just, you know, the consistency, no matter what the meta is, you're always seeing it just everywhere. I mean, recently it's been in Little Prince cycle with the Bomb Tower, but you can use it in heavier decks too. Of course, Lava Miner is a very popular deck, and it just always survives no matter what the meta is. I'm going to put the Minion Horde in D tier. Of course, you see some people use it, like inside of Mortar Bait, but you're not commonly going to run into it, and there's things like Arrows, Delivery, Poison, Fireball, which are just really great counters to it. Now, the Minions, on the other hand, way different story. The Minions right now, guys, are actually, I would say you can make the argument they're A tier, because inside a Goblin Giant, they pair extremely well. With Sparky, you're often going to play against them. And then, of course, inside a Giant Graveyard, they're very, very good. I'm going to move them down to B, but they're definitely higher than they usually are, just because of how good they are with the Goblin Giant as well as the regular Giant. And I'm going to put the Mini P.E.K.K.A. in B tier right now, because kind of like the Dark Prince, the Mini P.E.K.K.A. pairs very well inside a Goblin Giant, and some Goblin Giant players do like to use either the Dark Prince or the Mini P.E.K.K.A. in their deck. The Mirror's going straight in F tier. Don't even need to explain really why. I'm sure you guys probably understand why that is. I mean, it's just really bad. Everyone knows that. You're paying more to play the same card. Makes your cycle kind of awkward sometimes. The Monk is going to go in C tier. I think it's kind of on par with the Mighty Miner and the Archer Queen right now. Little Prince is just so much better, and I think they're all around equal. So, you know, I think they're all about C tier. Monk you're really only seeing in RG most of the time, and beyond that, you don't really run into him very much. Mortar's going to go in B tier. Normally this is in A tier, and even at one point it was S, but right now it's really not that great compared to other buildings like the Bomb Tower or even the Cannon, and just, I think a large part of it is because there's, I don't know, there's just way better options right now. People would prefer to run Miner Control without the Mortar because the Miner and the Poison most of the time is going to be enough damage. Mother Witch is C tier. I feel like, she kind of fell off a tiny bit recently, not really seeing people run her very much at all, and I think a large part of that is because of the Little Prince, and you're not going to have Little Prince and Mother Witch in the same deck. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense at all, and it's kind of the similar case with the Musketeer. Ever since the Little Prince has been meta, she's kind of fallen out of the meta a little bit as well. Night Witch going in D tier. I think she's very weak for the most part. You're mostly only going to see her inside of Golem decks, but when she is using Golem, that's part of the reason why Golem works. P.E.K.K.A.'s going in F tier. I truly think P.E.K.K.A. is actually one of the worst cards in the game right now. Obviously, there are some very good P.E.K.K.A. players that, make her work, but I would ultimately like to see P.E.K.K.A. get a small buff just because, I don't know, it's been a while since it's been, doing anything too crazy in the meta. Phoenix is going in A tier, definitely one of the best flying cards in the game, despite all the nerfs it got. Going to be very good inside of Lava Hound decks, Royal Giant decks, Graveyard decks. You could use it instead of the Baby Dragon, so just a lot of options you can use it in, primarily in beatdown and control decks, but if you really wanted to run in a cycle deck, you probably could too. Poison's going in S tier, definitely better than the Fireball. Don't know if Poison needs a nerf. It could just be because of how versatile and strong it is in the meta, but it is very, very strong, especially paired with the Miner in that Bomb Tower deck. That Miner Poison deck is just insanely, insanely broken right now. Definitely in this meta an S tier card. I'm going to put both the Prince and the Princess in D tier because they're both there kind of for the same reason. Prince pretty much never used. I mean, you see it maybe occasionally in that Rascal's Prince deck. Giant Double Prince pretty much no one uses anymore. Same with the Princess. Not many people are running Log Bait, and even when they do run Log Bait, they could run Dark Goblin instead. There's no actual requirement to run the Princess. The Rage right now I'm going to say is A tier. It's very solid in the meta, paired with the Goblin Giant. Now that's something that obviously could change, but I think right now, without a doubt, it is for sure one of the best small spells in the game. Ramrider I'm going to put in D tier. I think she's one of the worst win conditions in the game. Of course, you could use, Lumberjack Ramrider, Mega Knight Ramrider if you really wanted to, but at the end of the day, she's not that great right now just because there's a lot of win conditions that are better than her, and there's also a lot of people running things like the Bowler and the Electro Giant that do pretty good against her. The Rascals are also going in the D tier. I feel like recently they have just been in a really rough spot this meta. No one's running them inside of Mortar, or even Bait typically doesn't play them, so I can't really put them higher than D tier. Rocket's also going in D tier, so we got quite a few D tiers in a row, but sometimes that's just what happens. It's just one of the worst spells in the game right now. I think it's really kind of fallen off ever since it got that tower damage nerf, and it's kind of another reason why Bait is really suffering right now. The Delivery, though, on the other hand, going in A tier, easily one of the best spells in the game at the moment, especially in that Miner Poison Bomb Tower deck. It's just been ridiculously OP, and then even in Royal Hogs, that Royal Hog cycle deck has the Delivery in it. It's obviously not S tier because there's no way it needs a nerf, but it is incredibly, incredibly strong. The Ghost is going to be going in B tier. I think it's just fundamentally a very, very good card, and I couldn't ever really see it ever being below B because it's a card too you can play in a lot of off-meta decks, not even just in Bridge Spam. You could fit it in a lot of decks if you really wanted to, and it's just a really good substitute and can be annoying if you don't have the right answer for it in cycle, because normally it's a card I put in A tier, but I really just don't think it's one that could be much lower than B. The Royal Giant I'm going to put in C tier. This is the regular Royal Giant, by the way, not the evolved one. I truly think the regular Royal Giant is really just kind of average right now. It's nothing too crazy in the current meta. The Royal Hogs, though, are going to go in A tier. They're for sure one of the best win conditions in the game. I mean, you have the Royal Hog cycle deck, of course, but then you also have Recruit Hog. So there's two decks that they're exceptionally good in right now. And even though there's a lot of Bomb Tower in the meta, you could potentially outplay it. Or, I mean, besides the Bomb Tower, then they really don't have any, big counters, which is why they're so good. So the recruits, and these are just the regular ones, I'm going to put in B tier. I really don't think they could be much higher or lower than that. I think that's pretty perfectly placed. I don't think the regular recruits are that good. It's mostly the Evo ones that are very strong. The Skarm is going to go in D tier. I just think it kind of sucks. You really don't need to use it in really any deck. I mean, even Giant Graveyard doesn't really use it anymore. So you could even make the argument that it's F tier, but I think it's one you could use like if you want to, like in Mortar, so it's like usable enough. Skeleton Barrel also is going to go in D tier. You know, you can use it in Mortar, so it's actually quite similar, I guess you could say, to the Skeleton Army. Skeleton Dragons are going to go in A tier. They're actually incredibly strong right now. I think they're a very underrated card, especially amongst mid-ladder players, but the fact that they have more health now, there's just so many interactions that have changed, and they're a very versatile card as well. You know, using them in things like Mortar, Lava Hound, you can use them in Cycle, Beatdown, all sorts of things, and they're kind of like the Royal Ghost I was talking about, where, you know, you can substitute them in for many things and just overall fit them in a ton of different decks. Skeleton King, I'm going to put in B tier. I think it's, of all the champions besides the Little Prince, I truly think it's the second best champion right now. I think it's very solid when paired with things like the Tombstone or other Swarmy cards. You'll often see it inside of Mortar still, and I think the Skeleton King is, champion-wise at least, in a very good spot. Skeletons I'm going to put in A tier. Goblins, of course, have replaced them in a lot of decks, but Skeletons, don't get me wrong, are still very, very valuable. I'm going to put the Sparky in B tier. In this current meta, I can't deny it's above average, but it's primarily because of the Goblin Giant. I think that if Goblin Giant ends up getting another nerf, the Sparky usage is going to go back down, and it's probably going to be more like C or D tier. Spear Goblins are going to go in C. I feel like they're kind of nothing too crazy right now. A lot of the minor decks I'm seeing don't even have the Spear Goblins. They usually just have the Goblins. Tesla I also think is C tier. I think it's pretty average as a building right now. I just think the Cannon and the Bomb Tower you're just way better off using, and I'm not really seeing a lot of people running Expo either now. It's not to say that Tesla's bad. I just think in the current meta with how things are, it's just not in the best spot. The Log is going in S tier. It's a card where if even it got another nerf or two, it would still probably be an S tier. It just kind of has really survived the test of time, I guess you could say. It's gotten so many nerfs, and it's always remained the best small spell in the game, and honestly, I don't know if that's something that's ever going to change unless it gets like a massive nerf, but even then I feel like people are just going to be very loyal to the card. So Three Musketeers are going in D tier. I think that they're really bad right now. I mean, you could even make the argument they're F, but I see them, even though it's rare, occasionally, and, you know, they are very expensive, so it's expected you're not going to see them constantly, but they're definitely not in a good place right now. Tombstone I'm going to put in B tier. I think in this current meta, it's actually for once not in, you know, the A tier like it normally is, but of course inside of graveyard decks especially, you're going to see it a very good amount. And then Lava right now, a lot of the Lava decks I'm seeing sometimes are building lists, but of course Lava you're going to see it too, but I think right now it's actually B tier. Tornado I'm going to put in S tier. I think it's kind of similar to the Log, where it's just every single meta very consistent. You're always seeing a meta deck that has the Tornado in it, and just the amount of interaction, you know, capabilities, and just how it completely can change the tide of games, king activations, all that stuff. I mean, like E-Giant, the Tornado is very strong in, and I just feel like so many decks work because of the Tornado. And yeah, I mean, in this meta, you can't maybe say it's, yeah, extremely, extremely broken, but it's more so one where it's kind of like the Log, where just for how consistent it's been over time, it is probably deserving of a nerf. Valkyrie I'm going to put in B tier. I think that she's pretty solid, but I think ultimately the Knight is just a lot better in most situations, so that's why I have her a tier lower. Wall Breakers are going to go in A tier. They're very, very good right now inside of minor Wall Breakers, and then of course you can use Mega Knight Wall Breakers too if you want. I'm going to put the Witch in D tier because I think that she's slightly better than the Wizard, and the Wizard I'm going to put in F because the Wizard just, you know, really sucks. I think there's no reason they can't give it a small buff, and honestly that could be pretty fun because it's been so long that we've seen Wizard at the top of ladder, and that could really kind of make things interesting, you know, changes like that, so we don't have the same OP cards constantly every single month. The Expo I'm going to put in D tier. I mean, I think it's just the current meta. It's really just not a good spot for it. There's a lot of people running Earthquake, and even stuff like the Little Prince and Minor Poison just does so well against Expo. It doesn't really have many good matchups right now. The Zap is also going into D tier. I just think, you know, Snowball's a lot better than it in pretty much every single small spell. There's just really no reason to use the Zap, which is exactly why you pretty much only see it in Lava Hound. I'm gonna put the Zappies in C tier. Normally I have them higher, but right now no one's running them inside of Royal Giant. like they used to be used in, and you're pretty much only seeing them in Recruit Hog, so that's just one deck, and, you know, even in that, you don't always have to use them, so I think they're just kind of about average now. Alright guys, and now we are at the evolution. So in my opinion, the Evolved Knight is the best evolution in the game right now. This is a little debatable. Some people still think the Evolved Archers are, but I think after the Evolved Archers emergency nerf, I think now the Evolved Knight is back to the #1 best Evo in the game, and he is just insanely broken inside of cycle decks. The minor poison deck I was talking about, part of the reason why is because of the Evo Knight, and then of course inside of Hog you're seeing him constantly, and inside of Graveyard, just things along those lines. He's just so useful and valuable as a tank. But the second best evolution is going to be the Evolved Archers. Now they are getting nerfed next month in the next balance change, which is 100% deserved, and then they might actually drop down to A tier, but they are the second best evolution right now. Even after that nerf they got to their damage, they still do a ton of DPS, and that range boost they got, they're just so valuable, you know, on defense, and then counter pushing as well. They're just so threatening to deal with. The third best evolution, in my opinion, guys, is the Evolved Skeletons. Ever since they buffed their first attack, they're more likely to spawn and multiply, which is exactly why they ended up finishing #1 in the world last season inside of that Royal Hog cycle deck with the Evolved Skeletons, because they're such a nuisance to deal with, especially against decks that don't have a lot of small spells. Once you outcycle that small spell, they're really difficult and sometimes even impossible to deal with, especially if you have a tank in front of them and you decide to split them, having 2 go in one lane, 2 in the other. The fourth best evolution, in my opinion, are the Evolved Royal Recruits. Obviously, they got a very small nerf to their damage, but that's barely impacted them, and they have just remained to be extremely strong, and just the charging they do can be really frustrating to deal with. And then fifth, I'm going to say the Evolved Barbarians. Obviously, they took quite a hit after that nerf they got to their damage as well as their hit points, but inside of Lava Hound decks, also sometimes inside of other decks, you'll see them sometimes even with the Goblin Giant, or just with the Elixir Collector, or just kind of in spammy decks like off meta sort of things. I noticed they're an Evo that fit very well in those things, and on the defensive end they still get a ton of value, and I still think they're deserving of S tier. And now guys, we're moving into A tier with the Evos. So honestly, guys, you could argue every single Evo is an S tier, but to kind of help differentiate them and to put it into perspective, that's kind of why I'm going down a tier, to kind of show as they're progressively, you know, getting worse as I'm going down the Evo list. The Evo Bats, ever since they got that buff, it greatly helped them, which is why they're no longer the worst evolution in the game. But just compared to some of the others I listed, they're a lot weaker, but don't get me wrong, once they're healed up, depending on the matchup, they can definitely win you games, which is why you see them a lot inside of that Mega Knight Wallbreaker Evolved Bat deck. The next is going to be the Evolved Royal Giant. So the Evolved Royal Giant is actually the only reason why, in my opinion, the Royal Giant is even viable in the first place. I think if it weren't for the Evolved Royal Giant would suck. But the Evolved Royal Giant, because it has, you know, more health, makes it pretty decent sometimes, which is why you are, even at the top of ladder, sometimes going to run into Evolved Royal Giant, but just compared to the other Evos, it's really nothing too crazy at the moment. Next, I'm going to do the Evolved Firecracker. I know she's so annoying to deal with, and there's some mid-ladder players that still think she's one of the best evolutions in the game, but the reality is, you're only seeing her at the highest level, at least inside of Hog decks. So because she's not really versatile at all compared to a lot of the other Evos, and she's just fairly easy to counter with things like Fireball, Poison, Delivery, she's really not as bad as she seems as long as you defend her properly. And the second worst Evo, in my opinion, is the Evolved Mortar. I just really think compared to the others, there's just not people that want to run the Mortar over, say, the Evolved Recruits. What I actually see is oftentimes I see people run the Mortar with the Evolved Knight or the Evolved Royal Recruits, so they would rather have those two evolutions instead of evolving the Mortar itself, which really goes to show it's on the weaker end for sure. Oh, and I just realized I forgot the Little Prince. That's obviously going in S tier. It's debatably the most broken card in the game right now, which is why it's getting a nerf in the next balance change. No surprise there. So versatile, just so annoying, completely changed the meta. He alone is kind of the reason why the meta is the way it is. He has so much influence on the meta and the decks being used right now. But lastly, the worst evolution in the game, in my opinion, is the Evo Ice Spirit. It's probably funny putting the Evo Ice Spirit in A tier, even though I have the Ice Spirit itself in S, but it's really to help you guys visualize and differentiate them amongst the other Evos. That's the main purpose I did that. But of course, all the Evos are just going to be very OP. But the Evo Ice Spirit, even though they made it 2 cycles, it just really sucks, and there's no point in using it over the other evolutions, because I feel like with the Evo Ice Spirit, in a lot of situations, it's really hard to guarantee value. It's so simple for it to just go to waste and jump on the wrong thing or just get spelled away. Anyway, that is my list, the final tier list of the year. What did you guys think?